the first thing I have to ask you is the same question that was asked of me. What's your passion? What gets your heart going, Congressman Davis?
Well, you know, I've spent all of my life with, around, engaged with individuals who would be described as low income, disadvantaged, poor. I grew up in rural Arkansas. My parents were sharecroppers. I went to a one-room school. First school bus I ever rode on was a flatbed truck that a man used to use to haul hay. And so what really excites me is trying to help infuse a level of hope, possibility, and belief in the hearts of those who've been so described, to help them know that America can become whatever it is that we unite to make it. And so I wake up in the morning hoping that I'm going to meet people like all of you. First two words my mother taught me was to say thank you. So I thank the Kemp Foundation. I thank the Ricketts family. I thank the speaker and all of you for this tremendous exchange. And so that excites me, and I'm pretty excited right now.
Thank you, Congressman. I'm going to flip to the end of the panel and ask Mays the same question.
What excites me?
What gets you going?
What gets me going is Black people. You know, I consider myself one of the most vociferous advocates for issues that impact the Black community. And what really gets me going is changing the narrative, changing the dynamic as it relates to talking about Black people. You know, we hear about the community all the time. Community, community, community. But really, we're talking in code for Black people, right? And so the thing that gets me fired up is really addressing head-on issues that impact Black people, getting beyond the minority, getting beyond diversity or inclusiveness, and really dealing with the self-interest of the Black community, which I think have been lost in this new politically correct world that we live in. So that's what gets me fired up.
Great. Dave?
Yeah, I think what gets me up every morning is rebuilding neighborhoods, and I've spent most of my career kind of working in community development, and it really encourages me and excites me to see neighborhoods that are being renewed, and I think really we're starting to see kind of the narrative change. And seeing these as neighborhoods of opportunity. I think a lot of the old kind of adages around disinvestment or impoverished or some of these terms that we use to describe the areas that we work, I think that's changing, and we're now seeing terms like emerging neighborhoods and opportunity zones and those kind of things, and that's very encouraging. And so I get up every morning and I'm excited about seeing our communities change and our communities improve and people's lives being renewed and restored, and seeing those people benefit.
Awesome. Bob, what about you?
Well, like Danny, I grew up in the same time in segregation, and I'm inspired by the fact that I'm pushing back movement, but I left that movement in the late 60s when I realized that a lot of people who suffered and sacrificed most did not benefit from the change. And I saw a lot of middle-class Blacks like myself using the demographics of all Blacks to benefit, but when the rewards came, it came to them and not to low-income Blacks. And so I have spent the rest of my life working on behalf of low-income people of all races, that's the biggest divide. And I push back against this notion that people are motivated, as Danny said, to change, not by always reminding them about injuries to be avoided, but victories that are possible. That you have to be the agent of your own redemption. And the worst thing we can do is give people a good excuse for failing. And so my passion is pushing back against this narrative that continues to say to low-income people, oh, you are a victim of circumstance, your history of what happened in 1800, somehow you are a victim of. I push back against that and promote redemption and transformation within the context of where you are.
Right. So the title of our panel is Funding Positive Community Outcomes. And I think it would be helpful, not so much in sort of suggesting what to fund to this crowd, but how to actually define what that panel means, what the panel means. And really, so I'm going to stay with you, Bob, and ask sort of how do you define a positive outcome? What does that look like?
Well, first of all, you cannot generalize about poor people. Not everybody is poor for the same reason, and therefore the remedies have to be tailored to the group. The first group are people who are just broke. Their attitudes and values are intact, and they will respond to our opportunity. The second group who look at it and are discouraged because there are disincentives to achieve. The third are people who are physically handicapped or mentally handicapped. They need. But the fourth category is the one that I resonate to, and that is people who are poor because of the values that they embrace and the chances that they take. Just giving opportunities to people like that won't change anything. They must be a process of redeemed and transformed, and then opportunities work. And so we go into the most crime-ridden, drug-infested neighborhood, and we look for not the 70% of the households where people are raising children of dysfunction, but to ask ourselves, what is happening in the 30% of the households of people who are in poverty but not of poverty, or those who have been predators who've been transformed and they become ambassadors of peace. And so what I do is go into those neighborhoods, find these social entrepreneurs, these Josephs, and provide them with the kind of money, the kind of training, the kind of capacity so they can be agents to rebuild their community from the inside out. It only takes a small number of entrepreneurs to generate 70% of the jobs. It takes a small number of social entrepreneurs, once they become transformed, and so when I see an area like in Benning Terrace in my hometown of Philly, it had 53 murders in a 5-square-block area in 2 years. The police were afraid to go in. We sent 5 ex-offenders in, trained them, brought the gang leaders to our office, just 16 of them. They became transformed, and as a consequence, they were put to work rebuilding the community that they tore down, and as a consequence, there wasn't a gang murder for 12 years. And
Awesome. Great.
the housing authority was going to tear down the development for $13 million. Instead, they took 3 of it and invested in these young men to rebuild, and that was 21 years ago. And so I'm inspired because there's an example of when you can go in and see what the community was like, you see it transformed, and success is violence is down, businesses are starting, and people are using the streets, using ball fields. 300 kids are playing football on a field when there were no kids because of the violence. That's when I want to see concrete and specific measures of success as defined by the people suffering the problem.
So Mays, why don't you talk a little bit about how you define sort of community and the investment that should go in?
So community, again, I think we live in a hyper-politically correct world that is trying to figure itself out. So we talk about community, community, community. I have a motto, what's in it for the black people? And it was birthed out of all these meetings that I would go to, and it would inevitably be some white guy at the front telling us why this program is going to be good for the community, right? The community. And the community being us. And it always seemed like the guy who was doing the talking wasn't from my community, but he was going to be the person that got rich or got well-to-do. And I think that as we continue these conversations, I kind of push back on the concept that it's all about poverty, right? I think one of the things that we don't talk about very much in our community in the black community is economic development and the access to economic opportunities. And so oftentimes what I see in our community is the pain and suffering of black people being leveraged to create economic opportunities for people. So they create all these programs, and then inevitably somebody who's a tax lawyer or somebody is gonna start a corporation to take advantage of this. And so we don't see the whole economic pie coming back to our community. What we see is we get the social service program, we get the welfare program, we get them out of prison. Whenever we talk about economic opportunities, the benefit for black folks is always something that rescues us from this negative thing, as compared to saying, hey man, there are black business owners that are out here.
That's right.
But the investment opportunity doesn't go to the black business owner because he doesn't have the connect to the hedge fund guy. He wasn't the guy that was plugged to City Hall. So the guy who was plugged says, hey, you know what? I know all the people. Let me go find me some black folks that I can put up front that can, they'll be happy for they'll get their stipend. But how much wealth is actually being created? And so when we talk about black people and we talk about the community, when you ask me about success, I'm gonna ask you, who got rich?
That's right.
Who got rich?
Yeah.
That's success.
So, Dave, not to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I'm the white guy on the
obviously
spot.
the white guy.
Bring the white guy on.
But the work, talk about some of the work that you
Yeah. So
try and-
one of the things that we do is we run a micro lending fund, and it's a modest fund. It's about $3 million. About 85% of our loans are to small African American businesses, and these are neighborhood businesses. Our maximum loan size is $50,000. Most of our loans are in the $18,000 to $20,000 range, and we've made over 60 loans. We've recycled that money 3 times in the last 5 years. And these are the auto mechanic shops, the catering companies, the little delis and small coffee shops in the neighborhoods. And I think in terms of access to capital, quite honestly, our borrowers are people that if they walked into a bank would get nowhere. Number one, they don't have the credit, they don't have the collateral. They might have the cash flow, but their issues in terms of getting a bank loan, they couldn't do it. Plus, most banks won't lend less than $250,000. So these are the businesses that are the backbone and literally they're the main street of our communities. And so providing access to capital, I know that's been talked about, but that's a key element in any kind of community development strategy. You have to make access to capital, and particularly for those small businesses. So I'm happy to say that our delinquency rate is less than 4%. We've had multiple borrowers that have come back 2, 3, 4 times. One of our companies, one of our borrowers, Walton Contractors, was on the Inc. Fast 500 list. They went from $200,000 in sales to over $2 million in sales within a 3-year period. So these are.
That's what we ought to be talking about.
That's what we need in terms of access to capital and having that at the grassroots level in community.
Yeah, and
And we don't get rich on that. I mean, we lose money. You don't make micro lending. You don't make it up in volume.
I think the thing that we share in trying to get folks access to capital is the fundamental barrier, which actually gets to the racial structures that have been set up in the city, which is to get access to capital, you have to have some assets that you own or some network that's going to do a personal guarantee. And I think that's one of the struggles that we've seen in some of the neighborhoods. And I know, Mays, you want to talk about that, but that's an important hurdle to get to, and that's one that really has to fundamentally be focused.
I think, though, we live in Chicago, and we know the Chicago way.
You guys speak up.
I'm sorry. We live in Chicago, and we know the Chicago way. And when they want someone to be successful, they will be successful. Capital, no capital, they will put it all together. And I fundamentally think that there needs to be a rebirth of self-determination in the black community. I'm sitting here, And it's oftentimes they are talking about we. They and we. And as I listen, I always say, who is the they and who is the we? Does they have the money or do we have the money? And I don't know how that plays out, but I do think that we've got to really look at how race plays out and even getting access to capital in this town.
Yes, absolutely. Bob?
Yeah, and I think I agree with you, but there are lessons to learn from the distant past too. Because in the past, when we were denied access to capital, the black community set up its own burial society. We started our own railroad in 1868 in Baltimore when 1,000 blacks were fired. When we were denied access to hotels, we had a major hotel in every major city in this country. So if we were able to achieve capital formation during the time when we were young people, the question is, what is it that we did then under those circumstances that we can apply now? And I'm just saying that a lot of our time we should look internally about what are some strategies. But one final point, and that is, but people have to be prepared for opportunity too. It isn't just access to capital. And so we spend a lot of our time training, preparing people so that they can take advantage of capital. They have the will, they've got the passion, but what they often lack is the capacity. And so we help qualify them and then bring them to the table so they can use capital in a way that's good. That's all.
Just very briefly.
No,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
It's his turn.
Oh, sorry. No.
Well, let me tell you, I consider myself to be somewhat of a historian in terms of looking back, Bob, to go forward. And so I'm agreeing with both you and Mays in this instance in terms of realizing what African Americans were able to do in years past, all the way back after slavery. I'm doing the period of Reconstruction. I remember being with my father. We were in the cemetery looking at tombstones and all this, and I'm excited, and I said, Daddy, come here and look. This is Mr. So-and-so. So-and-so. He said, no, you go ahead. He said, I got a feeling I'm going to be here soon enough, so I'll wait in the car. But I said, well, how were these people able to bury themselves the way that they did? Mausoleums and great big tombstones and all. He said they had money. That's how they were able to do it. We had money.
That's right.
And I think that money to a community is like blood to the body. If all the blood leaves the body, you're going to die.
Yep.
I don't care how many sophisticated pieces of equipment. If all the money escapes a neighborhood or a community, it will die. And so it can't just pass through. It has to be retained, meaning that small businesses as well as major enterprises must exist. There must be a black soul food restaurant that the people who can cook can get a little piece of the money. There must be a barber shop, a laundry, a cleaners. That money has to be congealed and kept in the neighborhood. Many of the black institutions that had financial relationships no longer exist. 10 years ago, I could go to a black-owned bank in Chicago. Right. I cannot go to a black-owned bank in Chicago right now. I cannot go to there is one that an African immigrant family has purchased, Illinois Federal Savings and Loan, but nothing else.
Oh, yeah.
A few years ago, Seaway was one of the largest financial institutions in America. Owned by black people, it no longer exists.
Congressman.
May I just comment? The reality is that there were 20 blacks who were born slaves who died millionaires. One even purchased a plantation where his wife was. We need to learn about that. But also, as Pastor Soares points out in his work, part of it is how do we retain and make better use of the money that we already have. 70% of the people who play in the NFL 5 years after they leave are bankrupt. The same with the NBA. You can't say that their problem was a lack of access to money. It's that we've got to begin to teach ourselves to make better use of the resources that we do have. And that's an internal problem that Pastor Soares has been very effective in doing. We must embrace that as a critical element in our struggle to become revived and revitalized.
Maze is going to lose it.
Okay, one of the things we talk, One of the things we talk about on our morning show often about Chicago is in 1979, there were 28 black businesses in Chicago on the Black Enterprise 100. Today in 2018, there is one.
Yeah, why?
Right? So what you have to look at is there was a systematic I can't speak for everywhere else, but in Chicago, where all of the people that were the millionaires were made millionaires by black folks. So you were Soft Sheen, you were buying hair grease from Soft Sheen. Soft Sheen begat a trucking company, which begat a chemical company, etc. Well, what has happened now is the black millionaires in Illinois are no longer made by black people. They are made by the government. So we have now moved from entrepreneurial millionaires to social service millionaires, which is not really being a millionaire because that money comes back. And so what I think we have to do is really start to focus on how is the money being distributed and who is controlling our community. The people that are our business leaders now, they take their direction from the mayor because they got their millions from the mayor as compared from the black people. So that's why you see the businesses working on behalf of other people instead of their constituents.
All right, so I'm going to ask a question.
Okay.
And everyone has to answer it, so let's keep it short. Okay. So when you have seen positive outcomes in communities, what actually happened and who was involved in making it happen?
When I seen positive outcomes,
Congressman wants to go first.
I'll start.
He's
I
got
got
seniority.
started
he's the man.
out
He
of
is.
something called the anti-poverty program. I mean, that's what caused me to become a public person. I worked in healthcare. 2 of the community health centers that were created during that time, I became president of the National Association of Community Health Centers. And so we developed these all over the country. And every place that they went, they created work opportunities for people. They created opportunities for people to run institutions. So for me, that's one of the positive things that I have been very involved with for the last 40 years. And right now, there are about 2,000 of them that are members of the association. They take care of more than 25 million low-income people all over the country. They've produced doctors, nurses, administrators, and so I'm excited about the work we've done in that arena.
Great. Bob?
And Mays is right. What happened in my studies is that up until the 1960s, we were anchored in the private sector. But with the poverty program, spending all that money, and our public officials got in and had an opportunity to administer those, we transferred to a government economy. And we walked away from it. And we thought success was having officials in positions to give away this money. 70% of every dollar spent on poor people does not go to poor people. It goes to those who serve poor people. They ask which problems are fundable, not which problems are solvable. And so we have created a commodity out of poor people, and that's why we have it. So so the model for success for me is what Pastor Soares has done around his church. There is no other greater model for how a church takes its resources and transforms an entire area of a county so that There are businesses moving in. There are public housing, looks like middle-class housing. And he's got all kinds of other investments. Businesses are moving in, hospital built there, new school up. So we need to look at models that are already working and find out what is it that has been done there that can be copied around the country, because what he's doing and others is applying old values to a new vision. And that's what we must do. But we got to recognize what our problems are before we can move ahead. But we ought to be solution-oriented. I'm a solutionist. My political philosophy is radical pragmatism.
That's a new one. Radical pragmatism. Got it.
Yeah, so I think we're seeing some of this in our work on the far south side in the Pullman neighborhood, where we've been able to get businesses to relocate, industry to relocate. We've coordinated a little over $250 million of new investment and created about 1,200 new jobs. And so in terms of the results, we've seen a decrease in crime by 43%. Right. Violent crime is down 52%.
Right.
Unemployment is down 3%. We've got property values that have been increasing at rates of about 10%. So we're starting to see the benefits of that, but that's required kind of continuous, sustained investment and a focus really on a very narrow geography. It's very place-based. It's very much kind of focusing in a particular neighborhood.
And if I could just say, I'm a big fan of David's. We lived on the same block.
We were neighbors for many years.
And what he and people that he's worked with have done in terms of economic development, I mean, I kind of fault him every once in a while for leaving the block.
Leaving the West.
But they've done tremendous work. And when you see something, you can believe something. I mean, it's not just a matter of reporting. It's a matter of it actually happening. So I give you kudos, David, for the work you've done.
Thank you.
Yeah. Let me just add.
Can Mays just answer?
You know what? I think that the successful model of a project is when it's not benevolent, but the people that are involved in the project have the skill set, the ability to execute and do it, and there's not like, we don't have to go to like a situation where we're being benevolently treated,
Yep.
where it's some benevolence, like somebody has come and rescued us,
Yep.
but we've really taken on the responsibility and executed ourselves, and that at the end of the day, when the profits get chopped, that the majority of the profits went to someone who was from the community.
Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, I'm also pleased that I think we need to look at relationships as strategic relationships, and not whether it's somebody, what their history was and whatnot. I was very impressed with your presentation, and Ed Munzer was here from Ferguson. They need to be lionized, because I want to thank the Kemp Foundation for not inviting guilty white people to make presentations. Because I want people who can forget about all that and talk about, I have strategic interests. My plant, I want to put my plant here. It's going to generate X number of jobs. I need, therefore, 250 trained people. I'm going to invest in the training of people. That's the kind of action we need, not I'm going to give racial diversity training to my staff.
Yep.
Like Starbucks. We don't need that. I need somebody who said, I'm going to make some strategic investments in your community, not close my stores and give racial training to my employees so black people can buy more Starbucks coffee. That's not an economic end that I think we ought to be seeking. It ought to be what Ed talked about, what you're talking about. How do we offer real jobs to people who they can use those to rebuild themselves in their community? That's what we need.
Right on.
So I'm gonna push on that a little bit, but I'm gonna use Mays to talk about it. So in the work that we do with the LISC, it's really about going into the neighborhood and listening, and finding the people to listen to, not the ones that you would automatically resort to, but really in the grassroots. And it's missing. It's missing in engaging folks in planning, in decision-making, and investing. And so how do folks in this room, if they wanted to connect with the community, the real community, how would you recommend that they do that? How do you go find those folks?
So, I'm going to shamelessly plug. If you got something you want people to know, tune in or talk to us on the WVON Morning Show, Monday through Friday, 6 to 9, shameless plug. But I'm telling you, people, listen, 1690 AM WVON. Now, 773-591-1690. But I think the reflexive response is to go to the church for business in the black community. The reflexive response to everything is I'm going to the church, which the church has a role, but the pillars of the black community are business, politics, education, grassroots, and then spiritual. It seems as though all work towards the black community is, let me find a pastor who can escort me in to the community and sell it because he's got a congregation. When we have MBAs, we have people, black people that do everything. There's not one little group. And so I think it requires more than just, hey man, I got the outreach budget, give me 6 pastors, and then that's it. It requires actually spending time going into the community and investing. And who are the people that are making decisions? If the person that is making most of the times the people that are making the decisions for black people are not black people.
Correct.
They're not. So we've got to do more. We got to get out of our comfort zones and talk to people who we wouldn't ordinarily talk to or who may not agree with us, but can really get you through if we can come to an agreement. I'm sorry.
Well, I think it was either you or Bob that mentioned self-determination.
Right.
And unless there is a sense of self-determination and a sense of believing, for example, we celebrated a couple weeks ago the 10th anniversary of my Second Chance Act. I am so proud of the fact that not only did it create money, but there are people talking about second chances all over the country. Now, some people didn't recognize second chance as a big deal, but the real deal is we're the most incarcerated nation in the world. There's nobody in the world that has as many of its people in jail and prison. And we spend billions of dollars paying the consequences of that position. And so if we can keep those individuals, I know groups who formed businesses who are ex-offenders. They've formed their own business. Nobody else wouldn't hire them. So they created businesses for themselves. Self-determination, that is the socialization of self, to me is just as important as the end result of what happens because of that. Without it, I think we keep floundering, we keep hoping and having faith, but having the same conversation year after year after year after year.
Yeah, let me just support something Mays was saying that everybody likes to stay away from. You're right. You can't define intermediaries just being in the church. There are a lot of, I was asked by the Bradley Foundation in Milwaukee some years ago to identify grassroots leaders, and I didn't know anybody there. I went to the hairdressers, I went to the barbershops, and I asked people, where did they turn to in times of crisis? And the same 10 names kept coming, except 4 names kept coming up. And I knocked on their doors and said, why do people turn to you? And he told me. And then I said, who else does what you do? Next thing you know, I got 10 people in the room. And then, and that's when you go to the community suffering the problem, and you ask the people, who do they turn to? It was a study done by Rachel and Don Warren years ago. They went into low-income neighborhoods, and they asked questions that researchers don't ask. Where do you turn to? The first 7 institutions were friends, local groups, not-for-profits, whatnot. The eighth was a professional service provider. In light of that reality, we deliver services through the institution of last choice of those in need and wonder why we fail to connect. So we've got to find intermediaries that are not just in the church. Some of the churches are doing a great job, and some are not. Some of them are part of the problem too. But we've got to look for, as you say, May, honest intermediaries who are in there, but the qualities that make them effective also makes them invisible, because a lot of them are not protesting, they're not whining and complaining, they're not walking around with their hands out.
So what I think I'm hearing is the way to fund and support positive community outcomes is first, come into the community. Actually spend some time, learn about the community, meet people beyond what that typical road. Was that?
Yeah, can I just ask, though, that we be honest? And can we stop saying the community? Because the fact of the matter is we keep saying the community and we're ignoring the real issue. The real issue is that we're really right now talking about black people. And it's like we kind of move over here and say the community because we don't want to address the real issues. I believe that there's issues for everybody, but until we are able to call it out by name, until we can not be scared to say, hey man, I work with black people and I'm okay with black self-interest, we're always going to be dancing around this problem. So I just think that if we could do one thing, and it's okay for white folks to say black people if you say it respectfully, but like acknowledge us, right? Like stop trying to pretend that we're not talking about what we're talking about. That's all.
All right, with that.
Do that. I'll say one thing about that, and of course, if you're a politician like I am, I represent about as many white people as I do black people in terms of the geography of what I do. Fortunately, I can use the terminology black in every place that I go, because if I can't be me, then I can't be. And so I represent Michigan Avenue. And so if I can't go down on Michigan Avenue and talk about being black, then I may as well go do something else.
Well, let me just add that somebody may be my color, but the question is, are they my kind? And people are out here robbing and shooting and murdering and raping are not my kind. I make a distinction between those folks and people who are trying to raise families and rebuild communities. So don't associate me with them.
I got you. I would just say that as it relates to Chicago, no one has to not be able to say that they're not Irish. No one has to not be able to, you have the opportunity to just participate. Hey, y'all, I think it was awesome.
That's great about Chicago. Everyone's got an opinion, right?
Yes.
Right.
Thank you, everyone, for participating in the panel.